Hello everyone, and welcome to this last lecture of the first unit of the course. The first unit was largely devoted to classroom interaction, to the things that can happen during the classroom and how we use the English language in the classroom. We spoke about the errors that people make when they teach in the classroom, and this last lecture will be to some extent revision of what we have already discussed before, and to some extent we are going to talk about our approach to lesson planning. I will show you some of the approaches that are widely used in the British and the American language teaching world. Unfortunately, not many of them and not all of them are named the same way in the Russian language teaching methodology and language pedagogy. That is why I think for us in this last lecture it's very important to see what different approaches to language teaching we have and how these approaches are incorporated in lesson planning. One more thing that we will draw attention to today is what we call different objects in the classroom, what different activities are called in the English language. This is important because with the help of those activities and objects, the names of which we are going to study today, you guys will be able to use the English language when you teach English. And because to a large extent I believe that people don't use that much English in the classroom, and simply because they have never used the words of the simplest classroom objects that are around us in the English language. But I'll tell you more about that as we proceed. Firstly, some general questions that we ask ourselves whenever we are planning a lesson. Well, the first question is, who am I teaching? Not what, who. Why do we ask the question about who we are going to teach before we ask the question about what I'm going to teach first? We do that because in a way the modern paradigm of language teaching is student-centered. So if you swear to the student-centered paradigm, then you put the learner before the curriculum. Unfortunately, this doesn't always happen in our schools, and you can always tell me like, come on, we have the syllabus, the curriculum, the requirements, the exams, but what's the point of sticking so tightly and rigidly to the curriculum or the syllabus if at the end of the day the learners are incapable of achieving the result that they can achieve anyway, for instance, because their starting level is so low. I face it every day at university because the level of the students who enter even Moscow State University is very different. So we constantly have to adapt our teaching to the level of the real students. The second question is the what am I teaching? The goals, the aims, the target material. And the next question is, how will I teach it? So the methods of teaching. And finally, you think about, how will I know if the students understand what I'm teaching them? And if we conceptualize it, it can be put into a sequence of the 7 E's. The 7 E's of lesson planning. 7 E's because I will now give you 7 verbs that all of them start with the first letter E. And the first stage there is that you engage your students. Because I bet just like my students, when they come into the classroom, very often they are not exactly ready to start learning. So what you do at the beginning, some of you might be talking about the weather, like, do you like the weather today? Nice weather outside, or vice versa, what a terrible weather today. Some of you might sing a song, some of you might play a game. Personally, I like playing games at the beginning of my class. Some of the games would revise the grammar and vocabulary from the previous class. Some of the games are a bit more feed forward. Some of the games develop some transferable skills. One of my favorite games that I use for engagement and that you can play with your students is when you play the alphabet game. The alphabet game is a game where where we have a conversation, and every next phrase in the conversation has to start with the next letter of the English alphabet. For example, the usual first phrase in this game is a little alphabet game, and then the person has to react with a B, like a brilliant idea or brilliant. Can you explain the rules of the alphabet game? So the next person starts with a C, definitely a D. Every time you play the alphabet game, you have to start the next phrase in a conversation with the next letter of the alphabet, so every E. Finally, I seem to be getting the rules of the game. F. Great. G. How about we proceed from this letter and don't start it all over again? H. I think it's a good idea. I. J. Just let me repeat the rules again. So you start every next phrase with the next letter of the alphabet, J. Then K is a very challenging letter, and people either go for kindly remind you that we have decided to start playing the game now, or K, kangaroos are the most symbolic animals for Australia. So sometimes the game can actually become a little less logical, and that's a lot of fun for the students. So this is one of the ways that I use to engage my students, but it's just one of the games. Other games would include running dictation or bibbidi bop. Bibbidi bop is a game that I played today with my students, where whenever I point at a student and say bibbidi bop, BPT bop, that's what I say, they have to say bop before I finish saying bibbidi bop. So it's like bibbidi bop. Bibbidi bop. And if I say bop and point at them, they don't say anything. If you are curious about this game, just Google BPT bop. I can write it here. BPT bop. And you will find the rules of the game. A cool game because it warms up your articulator, so you get ready to speak, because it's quite hard to pronounce bibbidi bop. I mean, try now. Pronounce bibbidi bop. Bibbidi bop. And then you start playing this game, so whenever you say bibbidi bop, the student has to say bop. Whenever you say bop, the student doesn't have to say anything. And then you go on with you bibbidi bop. In that case, the student has to say their name before you finish saying bibbidi bop, or me bibbidi bop. In this case, the student has to say the name of the teacher or the person conducting the game at this moment before you finish saying bibbidi bop. Left bibbidi bop. In that case, the student has to say the name of the person on their left before you finish saying bibbidi bop, or right bibbidi bop. In that case, the student has to say the name of the person on their right before you finish saying bibbidi bop. And there are many more levels of this game that you can discover if you Google it. But this is just one example. Of course, songs can perform the same function. What I mean to say here is that before you start teaching, it's very important to make sure that people are ready to start learning. And people can be in all different shapes and psychological states, so sometimes you need a longer lead-in, a longer engagement stage. Then you elicit. You elicit by asking questions about what students already know. Why is this important to elicit before you start presenting and feeding them certain information? It is important because human learning doesn't work in an unconnected way. Whatever new knowledge you want to give to someone has to be connected to the knowledge that people already have. And that's actually surprisingly one of the things that the Russian psychology and Russian education has given to the world. It's called ZPD, Zone of Proximal Development. Vygotsky is the name of the person who came up with this idea. The idea is that whatever we learn, we have this zone of actual development, right? And that's what people already know. Now, if you want to make this zone of actual development larger, you think about the areas next to the ZAD, where people can learn something. And this is called zones of proximal development. So in a way, if your students like playing Minecraft or any other similar strategic games, you explore the world around what students already know. That's another ZPD. But you can't just hang some knowledge or skills in here in an unconnected manner. Why is it impossible? Because we, as human beings, our memory works as a huge catalog. So whenever you want to find something in your memory, you need to find the right connections. If you actually think of memory as a castle, right, the beautiful palace of mind, then you go around that castle and you put different things that you learn as you learn. You put them into certain rooms, into certain places in those rooms. Now, what's one of the most important things for you to be able to find the information that you have just acquired, or the skill that you've just acquired, is to remember where you put that, right? And in order for you to remember where you put that, it has to be connected to some other things that are around it. Otherwise, you will just not remember it because it will not be connected. So you will not be able to link it to a certain situation. In a way, it's like hashtags. The more hashtags the new knowledge and skills have, the better your students will be able to remember things. That's why we elicit. We want to find out what the zone of actual development is so that we can add new information to that current level. And what can easily happen is that you expected the zone of actual development be this, but what actually is this, so this is non-existent. And before you move to this zone of proximal development, you must first cover this, because it's impossible to make a jump. Human memory and human learning, unfortunately, doesn't work this way. Elicit, the next stage. Then, once you have elicit, you actually create a certain need to get some new information. And for that, when you feel that need, you start exploring. Just like Christopher Columbus, when he felt that the world that he had known back then was not the whole world. So when he had found that out, when he had thought that there might be another way to India, he started moving westwards from Spain and Portugal, and that's how he discovered America, right? Because originally he felt a need to explore that area. That's the same way how we explore languages. We feel that we don't know how to name something, or that there are areas where we can't function properly. That's how we start exploring. After that, when you started to explore, you actually explain the fourth E. You explain using different media, and the more multimedia your explanation is, the better your students will remember it. After that, you can, once you have explained the most basic things, you can extend. Right? So here you offer more challenging tasks and sorry, I think I jumped one stage. Before you extend, you elaborate. Because a simple explanation is not enough, right? A person has to internalize the knowledge and skills that they learn, right? They have to make it their own. And only after they have done so, after you have elaborated on the new knowledge and skills, you start extending. You extend, right? You add more. And throughout the whole stage, you can evaluate. And that is the seventh E. You can evaluate, right? You do it through formative assessment, and you will find out more about formative assessment in the second unit of this course. So in a word, this is what it looks like. You engage, elicit, explore, explain, elaborate, extend, and evaluate, right? This is how language learning works during the planning stage. Now, talking about the terms that are widely used abroad, but are not that often used, they are now more and more often used in the Russian-speaking language teaching world. But overall, still, I'm sure that for some of you, they may not be as familiar as they are to your colleagues abroad. Here are some of the acronyms that are used for them. Abbreviations such as PPP, TTT, TBL, and guided discovery. Right? All of them stand for different ways of planning lessons. The first of them is PPP, which stands for presentation, practice, production. How does it work? You start with a lead-in, right? Lead-in where you engage your students. I've already spoken about that. Then you move on to presentation, where you first elicit what your students already know, and then you feed them what you want to teach them. Then you move to controlled practice. This is the stage where you focus on the micro skills of your students. Then you move on to freer practice, right, to production, where students use the skills and knowledge that they have acquired during the presentation and controlled practice stages while completing meaningful real-life tasks. Because we learn the language to communicate, right? Communication is a meaningful real-life task. That's why whatever skills and knowledge we acquire during the lesson, it's really important to use it in meaningful communication. After that, there is a summary, a checkpoint, celebration of learning outcomes, and largely this celebration happens through testing the target skills that you have developed during the lesson. Here you have two more abbreviations, STT and TTT. Now what you can see is that you, while moving from lead-in to the final stage of the lesson, your TTT, which stands for teacher talking time, is supposed to decrease, is supposed to get less. Because our students are in the classroom to practice the use of the English language, right? It's the students who have to study English, not you, which means that they must have more teacher talking time. They must have more student talking time than you have your teacher talking time. The ideal proportion there is 70 to 30. 70% student talking time during the lesson and 30% teacher talking time during the lesson. Now this doesn't work with all of the ages, so obviously it's easier to achieve it with teenagers or adults. It's different with preschoolers or primary schoolers, but overall that is what we aim for. 70-30. If your balance of teacher talking time and student talking time in the lesson is far from that, do not worry. My research team had an assessment of, my research team has undertaken an assessment of 10 lessons that made it to the finals of the Teacher of Russia contest, the Best Teacher of Russia contest. Sure, you heard about that. And we actually measured the teacher talking time and the student talking time in those language lessons. And there was only one lesson where the teacher talking time was less than the student talking time. So it's an overall problem that we have in our language teaching community. But I think the first step in overcoming this difficulty is realizing that it exists. So focusing on your teacher talking time during the lesson and increasing the student talking time during the lesson. How can you decrease your teacher talking time? Mainly by asking questions. I heard it from one of the teachers of mine that a good teacher talks in questions. You can do the same thing. If you focus on the questions, then you will most naturally reduce your teacher talking time. And also you do it through activities. Because as I said, language is an activity. Having a language lesson where somebody explains something to you, but you as a student don't get to practice anything, is similar to coming to a gym and having someone tell you all about the different equipment that they have there and the different exercises that you can do there, but not actually doing any exercise, right? That would be very confusing, wouldn't it? right? If you come into a gym, you have this personal trainer of yours telling you all about the different exercises and their usefulness, but not actually getting to do any exercise. Same thing happens when you have an English lesson where students are mainly passive, where students are not practicing the skills but are just, sitting there, listening to some explanation and not getting a chance to practice. Language overall is more like a skill than like formal knowledge. At least our modern concept of language tells us that. So one of the main functions of a good language lesson is increasing the student talking time. That is why when you complete the final assignment of this course, when you work on your plans that you will have to develop as a final task of the whole course, one of the things that I would like you to focus on is having a lot of activities and thinking about how you can reduce your teacher talking time while giving instructions to your students. The shorter your instructions, the better. Instead, you can ask instruction checking questions, which you are going to learn more about if you watch the Golden Rules of Classroom Communication workshop. Now here we have this sequence, and the thing is that in a good lesson you don't design the whole lesson like that. You would have to you will need several lead-ins, several presentation stages, several controlled practice stations, and then you can move to freer practice and summary. So you can have 2 or 3 cycles like that in one lesson. Now this is one way we can structure our lesson. PPP, the most widely used way of structuring lessons, the most fundamental one. And I think according to my experience, around 70% of teachers only use this method of lesson planning. Now what are the alternatives? Well, there are some. One of them is test, teach, test. Particularly good when you are preparing for standardized tests is where you see, or if you have private lessons, where you first test a certain skill, or then you develop the skill and then you test it again to see how much improvement has been achieved with this particular skill. As I said, it's very good for private tutoring. It is also very good for remedial classes, right? When you focus on particular difficulties of your student, be it grammar, vocabulary, or something else. This way of assessing the current level at the beginning is very important, and then reassessing it towards the end of the lesson and seeing the difference. Usually seeing that difference is very motivating for the students, in particular for teenagers. What many people fail to do though is having this last testing stage at the end of the class. So very often you test something at the beginning, then you get too involved in explaining new things so that you actually don't manage to have the last test at the end of the class. Remember that the last test is very important because it summarizes what you have learned during the lesson, and it also usually, if the students have learned something during this lesson and they see improvement, this gives them a lot of positive motivation. Basically, it gives them pleasure, and whenever learning is connected with pleasure, more resource is allocated by the brain to make this learning function, so you will achieve more efficient learning after all. One more way of structuring lessons is task-based language learning. In this case, you have several stages. The first stage is pre-task. So in this, obviously, as the title of this method suggests, you build your teaching around meaningful tasks. And before you actually give this task to the students, you introduce it. And this introduction must happen in a real-life context. And here is one of the tasks that your students have to perform in real life in the Russian state exam. This is writing a letter to a friend. Now, if you think about this task, I bet it's pretty far from the real life of our students. Most of our students don't really write letters. What they write is emails. So at the introduction stage, you can think of writing an email to an English friend. And then you ask yourself a question, why do they write an email to an English friend, to an English-speaking friend? And there can be many reasons. For instance, they want to participate in an exchange program and visit that friend. So this gives you meaningful context for the task. Then at this stage, the students will, you don't teach, you don't present any language or any structure to the students before they have tried completing the task on their own. So they would complete the task on their own first, they would plan for the task, and then they would write the email, and then they would report on what they actually have. You look at it, and then you analyze it, and you give them more language that they could have used while performing that task. Right? So there is more analysis, and then you can ask them to complete the same task again. So it's a combination of TBL and test teach test. And then they see that they have improved. What is very important, if you build your lessons around task-based learning, in every lesson that you build this way, your students will have acquired a meaningful real-life task, which is very important for real-life communication. So language for pre-task, task cycle, and language focus. And one more method that is very tricky is guided discovery. Guided discovery is where students have to function on their own, and when you basically write an exploration plan for them so that you can lead them towards making their own discoveries. We use guided discoveries sometimes when we teach grammar. When you give your students a text which has some new grammar function in it, and they look through the exponent, they look through the examples of this grammar function in the text, and then they have to guess how it all works. They have to figure out the rule on their own. What is very important is that you communicate with them throughout, and that whatever hypothesis they may have, you accept it. Right? You accept it, and then you challenge it. So you say, okay, you believe that this is how the passive, you believe that this is how you express an idea that somebody else has done this. If we talk about the passive voice, for instance. Let's see, does it work in all of the context? And then you check it. So you respond, and then you extend. Then you give them more examples, and then hopefully at the end of this class your students will be able to formulate their own rule. So guided discovery is very good for grammar lessons, right? The lessons that are built around new grammar structures. So we have spoken about 4 different ways of structuring your lesson. Can you remember all 4 of them? Once again, the first one was called PPP, which stands for presentation, practice, and production. The second one was TTT, test, teach, test. The third one was TBL, task-based learning, which included the pre-task, the task, and the language focus. And the final one that you have in front of you right now is guided discovery. These are 4 leading approaches to lesson planning that are used in the UK and in the US. It is an alternative to the, well, in a way it is an alternative to what we have always done when we plan our lessons, but in a way I think a lot of what we do is pretty much the same as PPP or test teach test. So we have actually known this, now you just know the right words to explain what you do in the classroom. And I think if you ever communicate with your colleagues from abroad, or if you ever need the language to talk about what you are doing, or if you want to read more literature on what people all around the world do, people who design lessons just like you do, I think this can come in very handy. Now I'll give you 5 minutes of thinking time, and I want you to think of the lesson plan that you would choose for the first lesson on a new grammar topic. A lesson plan for a revision lesson, a lesson focused on writing a letter to a friend, a lesson built around a video about one of the English-speaking countries, and the very first lesson of the year. So I'll give you 5 minutes, so it's a minute per each of the cases, and I want you to think of what particular lesson plan you would choose for all of those situations and why. So once again, next to every lesson plan, every lesson situation, the first lesson on a new grammar topic, a revision lesson, a lesson focused on writing a letter to a friend, a lesson built around a video about one of the English-speaking countries, or the first lesson of the year, I want you to tell me whether you are going to use presentation, practice, production, test-each test, task-based learning, or probably guided discovery. You'll hear some music now. You can turn it off if it impedes, if it disturbs you from thinking about your lesson plans. There will be some time for you to think about your answer to my question. Go ahead. Okay, now let me share some of my that lesson plan for a particular situation. With the first lesson on a new grammar topic, I would probably try and use either guided discovery, GD, or I would use PPP, depending on what grammar topic that is. If the grammar topic is quite simple, so the students can basically decide on their own, if they can figure out the rule themselves, then I'd probably use guided discovery. I would probably use guided discovery with teenagers because teenagers are developing the capacity for critical thinking, and guided discovery is very good for the development of critical thinking. If the topic, I would use guided discovery for the topics like the passive voice, a new tense. I would probably use guided discovery for a grammar topic like forming adjectives or adverbs. This is where we can actually, especially word formation, that's where I can use guided discovery a lot. If the topic is more complex, then I would probably use presentation, practice, production, because that's easier. A revision lesson. For a revision lesson, I would probably choose test, teach, test. That's one of the ways, because here the students would be able to do some peer assessment, some self-assessment, and to see to what extent they have actually acquired the target knowledge and skills from a certain period of teaching. With a revision lesson, you can also use TBL. If you have been learning to complete a meaningful real-life task, then you can actually use TBL. You can use task-based language learning, where there is a pre-task, then they complete the task, and then you analyze how well they have completed the task. So that's another way, another approach to building a revision lesson. A lesson focused on writing a letter to a friend. Well, I've already used it as an example to introduce TBL, task-based language learning. Sorry about my handwriting. I'm writing with a mouse, which is a very challenging skill which I have to develop, but usually my students find it a lot of fun. If you ever want to use to write on your slides yourself and you don't know how to do that, here in the lower left corner of the screen you have this bar where you can basically use different tools, and this is the tool that I'm using now, which is called pen in English or feather in the Russian language. And yeah, that's what you use to write things onto your presentation. To some of my students, it was a revelation that you can actually write on your PowerPoint presentation, even if you don't have an interactive whiteboard that I don't always have in my classroom. A lesson focused on writing a letter to a friend can also be performed through PPP, presentation, practice, production. Presentation is when you present them with different letters to a friend, authentic material. Then you practice different parts of the letter. For example, writing the first part with the greetings, answering questions, and then writing the last part. So you focus on the micro skills of writing. And then production, where they actually write the letter. So you can do this through PPP. And if it's not the first lesson on writing a letter to a friend, you can also do it through T, and T. Test, teach, test, where you first ask them to write a letter, then you look at the letter, you improve the letter, and then you ask them to write a similar letter, and you incorporate what they have learned about writing a letter to a friend into the second letter so that they can see how their second letter is better than the first one. A lesson built around a video about one of the English-speaking countries. I think one of the good methods to use here is guided discovery. Because for many students in Russia, your English language classroom is the only place where they can learn about the English-speaking countries and their cultures. Well, of course you can tell me, like, now, Alex, everybody can use the internet to learn about the English-speaking countries, but I also teach teenagers, and not many of them spend their free time finding out about the English-speaking countries and their cultures. So for many of them, my class is the only place where they can actually devote some time to learning something new about the English-speaking countries and their cultures. So guided discovery here can be a method where you show them a video, then you ask them what they think is happening in the video, you discuss it with them, you ask them what they would do in a certain situation and what they think is all right to do in a certain situation in an English-speaking country and what is not all right. And then they find out the norms of behavior in the target culture. Another way to build this lesson, of course, is PPP, presentation, practice, production. This is an alternative way of building a lesson around a video. And you can also use TBL if the video that you're watching is about how to reserve a hotel or how to buy a bus ticket in the UK, then you can actually think of the task like, okay guys, you are at the bus station in the UK in London, Victoria Station, National Bus Service headquarters. You want to go to Bristol. What do you do? And there you can explore different options. You can explore the option of buying the tickets online. You can also explore the option of going to an automated machine where you can that you can purchase tickets from. So different options. It can be built around the task. And for the first lesson of the year, even though you can use all of them, you can use guided discovery, presentation, practice, production, task-based learning, or test each test, my choice would most naturally be presentation, practice, production, because that's the easiest way to construct your lesson. And whenever you have a challenging task, guys, you shouldn't overcomplicate it. Whenever you have you are facing a challenging task in your first lesson of the year, you are going to meet either your new students or the students who have most probably changed a lot during the year. So during the summer vacation. So what you should do is you should focus on them during this lesson and not on your lesson plan. So you can do presentation, practice, production, or you can also do test each test, but personally I don't really like when a new school year starts with a test. So if I have to conduct the first lesson of the year, I spend a considerable amount of time on the activities where students get to introduce themselves, talk about the summer that they've just had, and then we learn something new. And mainly I build it through presentation, practice, production, because you never know what the group dynamics is going to be with this group this year. Even if you have taught them before, students change a lot during the summer. And the dynamics that you can encounter can be very different from what you used to have last year. Now, phrases that you can use to begin the lesson. Let's get started. I'll unlock the door and let you in. I'm telling you those phrases because very often people just don't know the right phrases, or they use the Russian language instead. My research tells me that. That's why I want you guys to be well equipped with the right phrases to start your lessons in English. Good to see you versus good to meet you. What I've seen is that many people confuse those two. What is the difference between good to meet you and good to see you? Many people use good to meet you instead of good to see you when they see the people who they already know. Now the thing is that you use good to see you with the people who you already know. So when Dmitry, who helps me here around with recording those webinars, sees me every next time, what does he tell me? Does he tell me good to meet you or good to see you? Of course he tells me good to see you, because he already knows me, right? He doesn't meet me. Fortunately, Dmitry's lifestyle allows him to recognize me every time I come in for a new webinar. So what he tells me is good to see you, Alex, not good to meet you. But he told me good to meet you when we were introduced the first time, for the first time. That's why you say good to meet you to a new group of students, but you say good to see you to the group of students who you already know. I'll just check who's here. Is anybody away, absent, or missing? Right, these are the phrases that you use. Missing is, well, missing is less widely used, but still used. You don't use the phrase who's lacking, right? Because lacking is not used in this context. You can ask the students to settle down after that, and that's the phrase that is very widely used in the English-speaking context, but unfortunately not that widely used in the Russian-speaking context. We won't start until everybody's ready, right? That's a rule that you can set. Let's change or switch over to English, is what I want you to say at the beginning of your English lessons. Now it's English only time. In my classroom, whenever I teach teenagers or university students, I use this phrase, now it's English only time, whenever I start the course. And in my classroom, I have the following policy. Whenever I hear any of my teenage students or any of my university students use the Russian language for communication in my classroom, or whenever I hear them use the Russian language in the classroom, I first give them a yellow card. Like in football, right? I say yellow card. And then if they use the Russian language again on the same day, I give them a red card. Now, unlike football, this red card is not an invitation to leave the classroom. That would have been too easy. The red card means that they have to produce an essay on the topic. Why is it important to use the target language, to use the English language in the classroom? The first essay that they have to write is at least 150 words long. Every next essay is at least 250 words long. But I am nice. I sometimes change the topic. So every time somebody gets a red card, they have to write an essay, which is a huge investment into their written English skills, and also a nice policy to prevent them from using the Russian language in my classroom. Then we usually run through my students' homework. So then we say, let's run through your homework. And you do ask, are there any questions before we start? One thing that some people have used to have a problem with is, what do you actually call this document the students bring in if they are absent? Now the right word is absence note, right? It can be an absence note from your parents or from a doctor. Actually, asking your students to bring a document from a doctor is very uncommon in the English-speaking world, because actually your medical problems and the student's medical problem, that's a private thing which you do not share in the English-speaking cultures. That is why instead of asking the student to share their medical problems with the whole of the classroom, instead in the UK or in the US, people would ask them to bring an absence note from their parents. And remember that this is sensitive, private information that you do not share with the rest of the classroom. So as discreet and as careful as you can be with this information, please be careful, right? Personal data, especially with teenagers. You know, you make this mistake once. You once expose a teenager, and this teenager will be very unlikely to participate in your classes ever since. Be super careful with this age. It's a very sensitive age. That is why I want you guys to please do not ask your students about their medical issues in public. This is not acceptable in the target language culture. Now, this is some of the vocabulary that we looked at in the previous session about the accuracy of classroom language use. The first thing is the whiteboard, right? The whiteboard, this is not a blackboard, guys. Even if you are colorblind, even colorblind people can tell black from white apart. And this is not black, this is white. So if you have a whiteboard or a flip chart, don't call them blackboard. They are white. Some of the blackboards that we have in our classrooms are green. It's okay to say blackboard about them. You can also use the word chalkboard. Now, if you Google, if you go to a dictionary and translate this substance into the English language, it will give you the very awkward word plasticine, which is not that often used in the English language in the classroom. Instead, they use the word Play-Doh, which is the name of the company that produced it, but the name would stick, and so what you call it is Play-Doh. Another case where a brand name has become the name of a certain classroom object is this one, sellotape or tape. Right? Sellotape originally was the name of the company that produced that tape. That's why that's what you call it. Duct tape, some people might say it's duct tape, but duct tape is not transparent, right? Duct tape is black or blue. It's usually applied to wires, right? So it's slightly different. I hope you don't call it scotch, because you should not have scotch in your classroom. Scotch is an alcoholic drink, right guys? We don't bring scotch into our classroom, neither as a bottle nor inside ourselves. This is a lead or a chord. And once again, if this is completely new for you, revisit the previous workshop, which was about the most common errors that teachers make in the classroom, because this is on the list of the things that teachers usually get wrong. This is called not wire. Why not wire? Because wire is usually just a piece of metal, right? So wires are smaller. This is a lead or a cord, and on top of this lead you have the plug, right? Just like the plug that we put into the socket, we call this thing the cord, the lead with a plug, P-L-U-G. And you plug it not into the socket like we do with a regular plug, you plug it into the right port of your computer. So you can check if your computer has the right HDMI port or how many USB ports your computer has. You don't use the word socket. Now, surprisingly, guys, this thing is not called files in the English language, even though we use an English word for that. That's a false friend. These are called punched pockets or plastic pockets. All of those plastic pockets, no matter what the shape is, they are called plastic pockets. But this particular type, because you see punched holes in here, are called punched pockets, right? That's what you call them. This is a door handle. Windowsill and radiator. I had a student today who said battery while referring to this thing, and another student who said radiation. And mind you, these are Moscow State University students, right? So I'm sure that among us there are a lot of people who actually get it wrong, and that's okay. The reason why we get it wrong is that nobody probably has ever used this word with us, because some of our own English language classrooms were Russian speaking, right? So we never used English whenever we're talking about those things that are around us in the classroom. And this thing is called a tumbler. I went to Starbucks in St. Petersburg a couple of weeks ago, and a thing that I saw there was that you get a discount if you bring your own tumbler. And tumbler was written in the Russian language, just like tumbler, in the Cyrillic alphabet. So that's what you call it. You can also use the word thermos, but it's not that widely used. The word tumbler is way more often used. Now we'll play the same game. I'll show you 8 objects. That makes it 10, actually 10, because you have 2 objects in here and 2 different objects in here. And I'll give you 5 minutes of Googling times. I want you guys to go Google and find the names for those objects. Because this is an online workshop, so I want you to use the resource that you have. Find me names for those objects that you most probably have in your classroom. This might be an exception because this is more widely used with preschool teaching, but still I want you to know the word for it. You'll hear some music now, and this is the time for you to go Google, or you can go to a dictionary as well. But then if you find this word in a dictionary, make sure that this word is actually used in this particular classroom context. So 5 minutes of time for you to find those 10 words. Okay, guys, let's see if you and I have the same words. These are playmats. Playmats are a very useful thing for different station activities. Also a very good thing if you decide to have some activities on the floor in your classroom. For teenagers, like mostly use it with preschoolers, but for teenagers this can be actually the relaxing time because they spend most of their day sitting, right? So a nice alternative can be to spend some time on the floor, and for that you can use playmats. This is not just a toy and not a doll. This is a glove puppet, right? Glove and puppet. Overall, whatever puppet, whatever toy you can use for theatrical purposes, you usually call it a puppet. You have finger puppets, you have glove puppets, and then other puppets as well. This is glue stick. I hope this is the most straightforward thing. This has a British English word and American English word for it. The British English word for it is a push pin, right? Push and pin. And the American English word for it is a thumbtack, from thumb, right? Today, one of my students at university was searching for the Russian word for it. And she really badly wanted to translate it, so I allowed it. I said, okay, the Russian word knopka would serve your needs, probably. But if you think of the Russian word, even the image is different. Because if you think of the Russian thing, it's usually, like made of metal and different. And the connotations are totally different. The associations are totally different from push pin or thumbtack. Because even in the word itself, you have completely different associations. This, guys, is a notebook. Do not use the word copybook, because copybooks were used in Victorian England, right, where students had to copy texts from a certain framework that they had. Well, we still use some of the copybooks in primary school, where students have to copy different patterns, but we don't use them with teenage students. With them, we use the word notebook. Now, I don't know why, but probably due to interference, many Russian people use the word card for it. It's not a card, as you can see. It's a different shape, right? That's why the word combination that you can use for it is USB drive, pen drive, USB stick, flash drive, or memory stick, right? These are the different combinations of words that you can use to define this object and to name it. These are the headphones, right, or earphones if they are put directly into the ears. And these are the speakers, right? You have the word loudspeakers, you can also say speakers, right? And this one, not a single student in my classroom today could say the word for this thing, which I found completely surprising. They are all of them B2, C1 level of English, so they have very good English, but no one has ever referred to this object in front of them in the classroom. That's why they don't know the words for it. Which to some extent, guys, if you are school teachers, is your fault, right? You haven't taught them that, so they come to me and they don't know the word for it. That's why I'll teach you the word so that you can teach the students, so that when they come to me, they'll already know this word. So I'll check it. This is the dustpan, and this is the brush, right? Dustpan, brush, that's what you call it, right? Whenever you ask someone to clean up some mess in the classroom at the end of your class next time, use the English words for it, right? Objects around us. I hope you like this game. That's why now we're going to play it again. Here are 8 more objects. Please find the English words for those objects, and I'll give you 4 minutes to complete this task. Google it, go to dictionaries, and find the English words for these classroom objects. let's look at your answers. One of the things that this object is usually confused with is the bookcase. Now, a bookcase would usually look like that, right? It would be a case, right? A bookcase. This, though, is the chest of drawers. Unfortunately, you can't see the letter C here. So a bookcase looks like that, and a chest of drawers would look like that, right? And you have drawers in here that you can actually pull. And these are the shelves, right? If they are hanging on the wall in here, right? With books, these are the book shelves, right? So bookshelf, bookshelves, bookcase, chest of drawers. Now, I'm sure many of you would be inclined to use the French word jalousie, referring to this particular type of blind. Unfortunately, it is not. A jalousie, you call it a Venetian blind. Right? Still Italian, right? But you use a different word. You call this a Venetian blind. If it's horizontal. If it's vertical, like that. Right? We have it in a lot of classrooms at university, right? A blind that is like that, right? So you have those pieces of paper hanging from the top. This is called a vertical blind. So this is a vertical blind if it's vertical, or a Venetian blind if it's horizontal. Check what you have in your classroom. This is a projector. Now I'm specifying this because many people tend to use the phrase OHP, or overhead projector. Most of the OHPs are those bigger things, right? We used to have with transparent material that would put on it and write on it so that students could see it. So that's the image of the OHP, and this thing is just called a projector. Paperclip. Strangely enough, not many people use this word. This one is among one of the words that my students didn't guess today, and this is called a stool. S-T-O-O-L. Surprisingly, I don't have it here, so I'll just write it for you guys. S-T-O-O-L. So another false friend, right? We use the same word stool, but for a different object. And you can't use the word chair for this thing, it's a stool. Now, this thing that we have in higher education, I wonder how many of you are actually part of a higher educational institution. It's called a pulpit or a lectern, right? So you invite somebody to come to the lectern or to the pulpit. This is the screen, just like I have a screen over here, which is a large TV screen. This white thing that you roll down is also called a screen. And this is a coat rack. One of the things that we discussed with the students today is where they actually leave their coats when they come into university. Because at our university we have a separate cloakroom, just like you do probably in your schools. And then in the cloakroom they put their coats on a hook, and all of those words. Cloakroom. I'll write it here, just in case you have forgotten the spelling. Cloakroom. And there you have different hooks, just like a punch in boxing. Probably, if you have a locker room in your school, that is great. I don't know many schools that have locker rooms or lockers for the students. We usually have lockers in preschool though. In most kindergartens, students would have lockers for their things, which is a good thing. I probably prefer a locker to a cloakroom, but anyway, that's what we have. Now, some of the language activities that whose names I would like to give you today. Mingling. Mingling is when your students go around and ask each other questions like, hello, what's your name? How old are you? Where do you come from? Then the next student, hello, what's your name? Where do you come from? And so on. You call this mingling. Jigsaw reading is where you give different students parts of the text and they have to combine those parts of the text together. Dictogloss is an activity where I read as part of a text for you and you have to reconstruct it. It's a dictation type. I will talk more about this type of activity when I speak about formative assessment. So in the second module of the course, I'll give you a better example of dictogloss. Multiple matching is when you match different things that are in different orders. Cloze test is where you add words to a certain text. Act it out is when you role play different situations, and lexical sets is where you work with groups of vocabulary. Now, answering the question what language skills can be developed through these activities, mingling is used for speaking and listening. Jigsaw reading is used to develop reading, speaking and listening. Dictogloss develops speaking and writing as well as listening. Multiple matching can be used for vocabulary, grammar and reading. Cloze test for vocabulary, grammar and reading as well. Act it out is a very cool activity to develop speaking and listening. Lexical sets are good for vocabulary. I'm giving you those vocabulary words so that you can define your classroom activities in the right way. Now, before we move on, I want you to think about the phrases that you use to guide your student through your lesson plan. So what phrases and linking words do you guys use whenever you have to move from one thing to another? Can you think for a minute and write down one or two phrases? You can pause the recording now and write down the phrase that you actually use in your classroom to move from one thing to another. You can pause it right now, write the phrases, and then press play, because then I will give you the phrase that I used. Well, first, then, and at the end. I hope you have noticed that I quite frequently use those phrases. Now let's have a look at another favorite phrase of mine. Now I want you to turn to good phrase when you want them to turn to a certain page in the book, for instance. To continue, could you, and here is a task. For the next thing, I would like you to get into threes, right? Into groups of three. Moving on, let's yada yada, right? Another way to move throughout your lesson. Now let's go on to, or let's move on to the next thing. So let's check and make sure everything is correct, right? That's another way to structure your discourse while you are teaching in the classroom. And for the final activity of this workshop, I want you to spot some errors in the phrasing that we got from the teacher's lesson scripts. Look at the activities in here and try to spot an error. I'm now going to give you 5 minutes to spot the errors in this text. You can either pause the recording now and fast forward if you don't like the music. If you like the music, just listen to the music and correct the errors. Okay guys, now let's get through right and wrong. The first one, obviously, the mistake is in the word lacking, right? Because as we discussed, you ask who's absent, away, or missing today. And answering the question about what your students are supposed to say whenever you call the roll, you call their names, and they respond by saying here or present or absent, right? These are the words that are used in this context. In the UK and in the US, you say the name and they respond by saying here or present. And if somebody is absent, they say absent. These are the words that are used. In the next sentence, the mistake is in the preposition. So in here, you can see that, as I told you, it's at the end of the lesson, right? One of the most common errors, because actually you can say in the end, but the meaning is different. In the end means after all, and it's always opposed to something that happened before. Some of you might know the song In the End, It Doesn't Even Matter. I think it's by Linkin Park, but I'm not sure. The idea here is that after all that has happened, it doesn't even matter, because everything is so bad. Or so good. I don't remember the context of the song. So in the end is used as a phrase on its own. At the end of something, at the end of the lesson. The preposition has to be at. The next sentence illustrates one of the most common errors that I've already touched upon in the previous workshop about the accuracy of classroom language use. So if you have noticed, if you have spotted, very well done you. Because you probably remember that we use the future tense whenever we are talking about the things that we are going to do or that we will do. By the way, now you are going to read the book is totally fine. Or now let's read the book is also totally fine. And it's answering the questions because these are the questions in the book. It's the image in our head is definite. That's why we use the definite article. A moment of silence is, I hope you never have a moment of silence in your classroom, because we only have a moment of silence when something really bad happened, right? For instance, somebody has passed away. We ask for a minute of quiet, right? Easy to confuse, moment of silence, minute of quiet. We ask for a minute of quiet, not a moment of silence. You move on to Shakespeare or go on to Shakespeare, but you get on with Shakespeare, right? And get on with something means to start something, right? Let's get on with Shakespeare, right? When you start reading Shakespeare or discussing Shakespeare. And the last thing in here is repeating is a mechanical action, like repeat, 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 repeat. Now I'm repeating the word repeat, right? So you repeat this very word. What your students need to do, they need to revise the words before the test, not repeat them. Right? Otherwise, you are calling on a very mechanical action, which would highly unlikely help your students. Though it might help some students to revise words. Repeating words can help them revise words, though there are also other strategies of vocabulary revision. My final remarks are: plan your lessons in advance. Think of the language you are going to use when you plan your lessons. That is why in this course we are going to ask you to write your lesson plan as a scenario as a script that would include what you are going to say whenever you are conducting this lesson. Whenever you are thinking of your lesson plan, imagine your classroom environment and make sure that you can name all of the objects around you so that you don't end up in this thing situation whenever you can't name an object in your own classroom. Actually, a very good strategy for this, to help you remember the objects and to help your students remember the objects, use sticky notes, right? And place the names of the objects around the classroom. This way, you are going to learn the names of different classroom objects much faster. And guess what? Your students are going to learn the names of different classroom objects much faster. By the way, a cool game with sticky notes is once when they have already learned the names of different classroom objects, put the labels onto the wrong objects. So when the students come in and have them notice this, like, you know, why is this called the radiator? This is not a radiator. And then have them rearrange it. Can be a fun activity. Communicate in English during the lesson. This is the overall message of the first unit. communicate in English. This is the subject that we teach. Teach your students some classroom language and be aware of the mistakes that you make when you teach English and work on them. Because it's okay to make mistakes. I don't know, probably I have made some mistakes even now conducting this training event with you. What I'm going to do though, I'm going to watch this training event, the video recording of this training event, and if I spot some of the errors that I usually make, I will work on them, and probably in the next unit I will not be making those mistakes. You'll see that. So be aware of your problems and work on them, because awareness is the first step towards healing the disease, right? So if we conceptualize the problem of starting to speak English in your classroom as a problem, then we can address it. Then we can actually figure out what are the things that make it so difficult for us to use English in the classroom, and working on them, on those, we can probably become much better as teachers. Now, this was the last workshop of the first module. I have drawn 4 stars in here for you for the 4 lectures, for the 4 webinars that you have completed. Well done, guys. I'm sorry if this lecture was too long, or if there have been too many practice tasks, because this is how we actually teach language. We teach language through practice. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope you have learned something new. Feel free to share the things that you have learned with your colleagues. And good luck with the practice tasks, and good luck with the 2nd, 3rd, and the 4th unit of this course. See you soon. Bye.